Have you ever wondered what it feels like to destroy the place where you were born? To stand on the ashes of your own childhood and call it progress? The helicopter landed on Main Street on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. The sound of its blades echoing through empty windows where laughter once lived, where children once ran, where dreams once grew like wildflowers in the cracks of old sidewalks. Alexander Stone stepped out, his $1,000 shoes touching the ground that once knew him barefoot. The man who owned half the world had come home to buy the other half, to erase it, to make it disappear like it never mattered. But in her weathered hands, Clara Martinez held something more powerful than money. A deed, yellowed with time, signed with love, witnessed by hope. The deed to her grandmother's bakery, the last building standing in the path of his empire. She was just a baker with flour under her fingernails and secrets buried deeper than foundations. He was a billionaire who forgot that some things can never be bought, never be sold, never be destroyed. But sometimes the past demands payment. Sometimes forgetting costs more than remembering ever could. The town hall meeting was orchestrated like a funeral, residents gathering to witness their own burial. They sat in metal folding chairs, the same chairs that held their children during school plays, during Christmas pageants, during all the moments that made life worth living. Alexander's proxy lawyers spoke in corporate euphemisms. Revitalization, they said, when they meant erasure. Improvement, they promised, when they planned displacement. Economic opportunity, they declared, while counting the cost of everything they would destroy. One by one, her neighbors raised their hands, signatures bought rather than earned, democracy dying in silence, hope sold to the highest bidder. But Clara's voice cut through the chorus of resignation. No. The room turned, faces she'd known since childhood staring like she'd spoken in tongues. Like defiance was a foreign language they'd forgotten how to speak. I understand perfectly, Clara said, standing slowly, her grandmother's strength flowing through arthritic fingers. You want to build tomorrow on the graves of yesterday, but some things are not for sale. The silence stretched, thick as molasses, heavy as regret. Around her, people who'd borrowed sugar, who'd bought birthday cakes, who'd found comfort in her kitchen, now looked away. Outside, the helicopter waited. Inside its leather seats, Alexander Stone watched the meeting through tinted windows. He couldn't see Clara's face, but he could feel her resistance like a splinter in his conscience that no amount of success could remove. After 30 years, she was still there, still fighting, still believing, still remembering what he'd worked so hard to forget. The excavation began at dawn with the sound of progress, heavy and unforgiving. Bulldozers and backhoes, mechanical beasts hungry for the past, ready to devour decades of dreams. The construction crew found the first box while digging Clara's basement expansion. Metal, rusted but intact, wrapped in plastic that had somehow survived 30 years underground. Inside, blueprints. Not the kind architects draw today, but the hand-drawn dreams of a child who believed in impossible things. Plans for a community center detailed down to the drinking fountains, sketches of playgrounds where laughter would echo for generations, designs for a library where stories would live forever, safe from the hunger that devours dreams. And in the corner, in handwriting that trembled with hope and determination, a signature. Alexander Stone, age 12, future architect of happiness. Clara recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same script that used to appear on scraps of paper left on her grandmother's counter. Thank you for the cookie. I'll pay you back someday, promise. Alexander. But there was more. Hidden beneath her bakery's basement, they found a time capsule. Inside, photographs. Alexander at 7, gap-toothed and laughing, standing next to Clara's grandmother. Both of them covered in flour, both of them happy in the way that only comes from finding family where you least expect it. A letter in her grandmother's handwriting, careful cursive flowing like prayer. To whoever finds this, know that this boy has the biggest heart I've ever seen. He draws pictures of the town he wants to build, full of joy, full of hope, full of love. If something happens to me, please tell him that I believe in his dreams. Below the letter, more drawings. Plans for affordable housing, designs for a medical clinic, sketches of a school where every child would have enough to eat. And at the bottom, a promise written in ink that had faded but never disappeared. I will never forget where I came from. I will use everything I learned to come back, to build something beautiful for the people who saved me. Signed, Alexander Stone. Forever grateful. Clara sat in the dust of her demolished neighbors' homes, holding evidence of the boy Alexander used to be. The dreamer who'd become the destroyer. The child who'd promised to build happiness for everyone, now bulldozing happiness for profit. Alexander Stone stood in his penthouse office 40 floors above the city, watching the sunset paint everything gold. But gold, he'd learned, was just another color for loneliness. His assistant entered with the day's reports. The Millbrook project is ahead of schedule, sir. The demolition should be complete within the month. Millbrook. He didn't let his face show recognition, didn't let her see the way that name still made his chest tight, still made his hands remember the weight of hunger, of shame, of dreams too big for a boy too small. Just one holdout, sir. A bakery. The owner refuses to sell, but legal says it won't matter. Eminent domain will handle it. After his assistant left, Alexander walked to his private safe. Behind all the paper proof of his success sat a single photograph. Faded, creased. In it, a boy and an old woman, both smiling, both covered in flour, both radiating the kind of joy that money can't buy, can't build, can't preserve. Clara's grandmother, Abuela Maria, the only person who'd ever looked at him and seen something worth saving, who'd fed him when his own family forgot he needed feeding, who'd listened to his dreams when everyone else heard only noise. He'd kept the photograph through college, through business school, through the first million, through the first billion, kept it like a reminder of who he used to be before success made him forget how to feel. That night, Alexander found himself driving through the empty streets of his childhood. He parked where his house used to stand, just a vacant lot now marked with orange cones and warning signs. Why was he doing this? The question he'd been avoiding for months now echoed in the hollow spaces where his heart used to live. He had enough money to buy countries, enough power to move mountains, enough influence to change the world. But he was using it all to erase the only place that had ever felt like home. To destroy the only woman who might still remember the boy he used to be, before ambition ate his soul, before success became his religion, before forgetting became survival. Clara Martinez was not just a baker, she was an archaeologist of truth, digging through layers of lies with hands that knew how to separate what rises from what falls. The Millbrook Public Library stayed open late on Wednesdays, and Clara had become its most dedicated patron. She hunted in the archives, in the basement, where truth went to hide from those who preferred comfortable lies. The first clue came in a zoning report from 1995. Alexander Stone, just 22, fresh from business school, had requested permission to build low-income housing where the old mill stood, housing for families who'd lost their homes when the factory closed. Denied. Unanimously by a town council that included 3 men who would later become very wealthy in very mysterious ways. The second clue waited in environmental reports, files so thick they could have been novels. Alexander had commissioned the reports himself, paid for soil testing, water analysis, air quality measurements, spent his own money to prove that the town could be healed, could be saved, could be made whole again. But the results had disappeared from official records, vanished like morning mist. The contamination was worse than anyone admitted. Decades of industrial waste seeping into groundwater, into gardens, into the lungs of children who played where poison grew like wildflowers in toxic soil. Alexander's reports recommended immediate action, emergency funding, relocation assistance for families living on poisoned ground. He'd volunteered to oversee the cleanup, to manage the relocation, to rebuild on clean earth with clean money, with clean conscience. But the governor had other friends, other priorities, other wallets to fill. Alexander's recommendations were buried along with the truth, along with the health of everyone who stayed. Clara sat in the fluorescent light, surrounded by evidence of 30 years of secret sacrifice. Alexander wasn't the villain in this story. He was the hero disguised as the destroyer, the savior masked as the conqueror, the boy who'd never stopped trying to keep his childhood promises, even when keeping them required becoming everything he'd once stood against. The package arrived at Alexander's office on a Tuesday morning. Inside, photographs of him as a child standing next to Clara's grandmother, both of them laughing, both of them covered in flour. Pictures he thought existed only in his memory. The environmental reports he'd buried were resurrected, photocopied, annotated in careful handwriting that proved someone had been paying attention. Someone remembered when he tried to save everything before he learned to destroy it instead. And at the bottom, a single note handwritten on bakery stationery. "Alexander, I know who you really are. I know what you're really doing. I know why you're really here. Call me before it's too late for both of us. Clara." Alexander stared at the phone number for 3 hours, his finger hovering over digits that connected present to past, empire to origins, man to boy, destroyer to dreamer. The call, when it finally came, was not what Clara expected. "Is this the woman who thinks she knows me?" Alexander's voice carried across 30 years, changed by power, hardened by disappointment, sharpened by the kind of pain that money cannot heal. "This is the woman who remembers you," Clara answered, her voice steady, certain. "The boy who drew pictures of playgrounds, who promised to build happiness, who believed that love was architecture enough for any dream." Silence stretched between them, filled with ghosts and memories, and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone, unchanged, or easily explained. "That boy is dead," Alexander said, but his voice carried no conviction, only grief, only loss. "No," Clara whispered, and in that single word carried 30 years of belief, of faith, of stubborn hope. "That boy is the only reason you're destroying this town, instead of saving it. That boy is the only reason you're trying to erase the place that loved you when you had nothing, when you were nothing, when you needed everything." The abandoned church stood at the crossroads of what was and what might be, its steeple pointing toward heaven like a question or a prayer. Clara arrived first, as she always did. She sat in a pew worn smooth by 3 generations of knees and prayers, and sorrows too deep for words, but not too deep for hope. Alexander's car pulled up at exactly midnight. He entered like a stranger in a place where he'd once served as altar boy, where he'd once believed in miracles, where he'd once prayed for strength to become something good, something worthy. "Hello, Alexander," Clara said without turning, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Clara." Her name sounded strange in his mouth after 30 years of not saying it, of not thinking it, of not remembering the girl who'd watched from bakery windows as he'd grown from hungry boy to broken man. She turned and saw him, really saw him for the first time since he'd returned. The boy was still there, buried beneath expensive suits and practiced indifference and all the armor that success builds around hearts too tender to survive in worlds too cruel for tenderness. "Sit," she said. Not a command, but an invitation, the kind her grandmother used to offer to anyone who needed a place to rest, a moment of peace. Alexander sat 2 pews behind her, close enough for conversation, far enough for escape. "Why?" Clara asked, the question floating between them like incense, like prayer, like the ghost of everything they'd never said to each other. "Why are you destroying the place that saved you?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he'd forgotten how to answer questions that couldn't be deflected with corporate speak, with legal language, with careful emptiness. "Because," he finally whispered, "it's the only way to save it." The truth hung between them, strange and terrible and beautiful, like all truths that have been buried too long in hearts too afraid to speak them. "Tell me," she said, and in those words was everything her grandmother had taught her about listening, about patience, about the kind of love that waits, that believes, that never gives up on anyone, especially the ones who've given up on themselves. So Alexander told her about the contamination reports that no one would read, about the environmental studies that no one would believe, about the systematic poisoning of everyone he'd ever cared about by people who cared more about profit margins than human lives. He told her about buying the town piece by piece, family by family, not to destroy it, but to relocate everyone to clean ground, to safe ground, to the future he'd been dreaming since he was 12, and believed that architecture could be an act of love. "But why didn't you tell anyone?" Clara asked. "Why let them hate you, fear you, think you were the villain? Because if they knew, they'd want to stay. They'd want to fight. They'd want to save something that's already dead. And they'd die trying to save it, the way my mother died, the way your grandmother died, the way everyone who loves this place eventually dies from loving what kills them." Clara understood finally, completely, the terrible mathematics of love that calculates loss in advance, that chooses heartbreak over hope, that disguises salvation as destruction, because sometimes saving someone requires becoming their enemy. But there was something darker moving in the shadows behind Alexander's carefully constructed plan. The board meeting that Alexander wasn't invited to took place in a conference room 40 floors above his office, in a building he thought he owned. 12 men in identical suits discussing his future like he was a stock option to be exercised or allowed to expire worthless. "The Millbrook situation has become problematic," said the chairman, a man whose name never appeared on company documents, whose face never appeared in photographs, whose existence was rumored like urban legend. "Alexander has become sentimental," agreed another voice, clinical, surgical, precise. Clara discovered the truth in the basement of the library 3 days after her meeting with Alexander. The environmental impact statement buried in subsection 47B told a story that made her stomach turn cold, made her hands shake with rage and recognition. The contamination wasn't accidental. The factory that had poisoned 3 generations of children had been designed to contaminate, had been built to make the land uninhabitable, had been operated with deliberate negligence until the soil, the water, the air became too toxic for human life, but perfect for mineral extraction. Rare earth metals buried beneath the contaminated soil, worth more than the lives lived above it. $60 billion in minerals that had been mapped before Alexander's father had been murdered, before her grandmother had been poisoned, before either of them had been born into a war they'd never been told they were fighting. Alexander had been buying the town to save it, but the real owners had been buying Alexander to use him, had been manipulating his guilt, his grief, his desperate need to honor the woman who'd loved him when love was all she had to give. Clara sat surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy, 30 years in the making, a slow-motion genocide disguised as economic development. But she'd learned something that Alexander, in all his power, in all his wealth, had forgotten. She'd learned it from her grandmother, who'd learned it from women who'd survived slavery and genocide, and systematic attempts to erase them from history. Some fights can't be won with money. Some enemies can't be defeated with lawyers. Some wars require weapons that powerful people never see coming. The weapon she was preparing had been forged in bakery ovens, sharpened in community meetings, loaded with 30 years of accumulated love, accumulated trust, accumulated knowledge about who could be counted on when counting mattered most. The basement of Clara's bakery became a war room where flour sacks served as filing cabinets, where rolling pins held down architectural plans, where the smell of rising dough mixed with the sharp scent of photocopied evidence. Alexander arrived at midnight using the back entrance like a man returning to a childhood he'd thought was lost forever. "They used us," Clara said without preamble. "They used your guilt, your love, your desperate need to save everyone, to make you the perfect weapon against everyone you were trying to protect." Alexander looked at the evidence spread. Across surfaces where his grandmother had rolled out cookies, had kneaded hope into daily bread, had fed him body and soul with hands that had been slowly poisoned by the same people who were now using his love for her to finish what they'd started. "The minerals," he said, his voice hollow with recognition. "They never told me about the minerals. They let me think the cleanup was about environmental protection, about public health, about doing what's right." "It was," Clara said, and in her voice was everything her grandmother had taught her about recognizing goodness, even when it's buried under layers of manipulation. She showed him the geological surveys, the mineral assessments, the extraction plans that had been drawn up before his father had been murdered, before her grandmother had been poisoned. $60 billion in numbers that reduced human lives to acceptable losses. "What do we do?" Alexander asked. And in that question was the boy who'd once believed that adults had answers, that problems had solutions, that good eventually triumphed over evil. Clara smiled for the first time in months, the smile of someone who'd been carrying a secret weapon so powerful, so dangerous, so completely unexpected, that even she had been afraid to use it until now. "We tell everyone," she said, "everyone, every person who's ever bought bread from this bakery, every family who's ever celebrated in this building, every child who's ever pressed their nose against these windows, hungry for something more than food, hungry for belonging, for love, for the kind of community that makes survival feel like living. They'll destroy us, Alexander said, and his voice carried 30 years of learning that power always wins, that money always triumphs. Maybe, Clara agreed, but they can't destroy what we've already built. They can't kill what's already lived. They can't erase what people remember about being loved, about belonging, about the taste of bread made by hands that cared whether they had enough to eat. That night they worked until sunrise. Alexander's corporate resources turned against his own board, his insider knowledge weaponized against the system he'd spent 30 years climbing. Clara's lifetime of relationships activated like a network that no amount of money could infiltrate. By morning, the story was everywhere. Not the sanitized version that corporate communications usually crafted, but the real story told in the language that Clara's grandmother had taught her, the language of truth seasoned with love, served with hope that survives everything. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with faces Clara had known since childhood, faces lined with the accumulated weight of 30 years of breathing poisoned air, of drinking contaminated water, of loving a place that was slowly, systematically killing them. Alexander sat at the defendant's table, though he wasn't technically on trial. But in a deeper sense, in the sense that mattered to the people filling every seat, Alexander Stone was on trial. Not for the crimes he'd committed, but for the crime of believing that he could save everyone by becoming their enemy. Clara took the stand first. I've known Alexander Stone since he was 7 years old and hungry, not just for food, but for someone to see him, to value him, to believe that his life mattered. She told them about the boy who'd drawn pictures of playgrounds, who'd promised to build happiness, who'd believed that architecture could be an act of love. She told them about the environmental reports he'd commissioned, the health studies he'd funded, the clean-up plans he'd drafted with his own money, his own time, his own desperate need to honor the woman who'd fed him when he had nothing. She told them about the manipulation, the lies, the systematic deception that had turned his love into a weapon, his guilt into ammunition, his desperate desire to save everyone into the perfect tool for destroying everything he was trying to protect. They used his heart against our hearts, Clara said, and her voice broke just slightly. They turned his love for us into our reason to hate him. They made his sacrifice look like our betrayal. The courtroom shifted like a living thing, like an organism processing information that changed everything about what they'd thought they knew about heroism, about villainy, about the terrible complexity of trying to do good in a world designed to reward evil. Alexander's testimony came next, his voice shaking not with fear but with the accumulated weight of secrets too heavy for one conscience to carry. He told them about his father's murder, about his mother's slow death from contamination she'd never been warned about. He told them about discovering that his success, his empire, his carefully constructed image of power had been built on the systematic destruction of everything he'd ever loved. I thought that if I could just get everyone to safe ground, I could explain later. I thought I could bear your hatred if it meant you would live to hate me in places where loving wouldn't kill you. The verdict, when it came, satisfied no one completely. The shadow corporation dissolved into other shadow corporations, like water soaking into different ground. Different names, same poison, same greed. But something else had been decided in that courtroom, something that couldn't be appealed or overturned or bought with any amount of money. The people had decided that they'd been fighting the wrong enemy, had decided that Alexander Stone, the man they'd hated for trying to save them, deserved something more complicated than hatred, more difficult than forgiveness, more lasting than justice. They'd decided he deserved a chance to build the dreams he'd drawn as a 12-year-old boy who believed that love was architecture enough for any future worth building. From the ashes of everything they'd lost, something they'd never imagined began to grow. Not the town that had been, but something different, something that honored both past and future, both memory and hope, both the people they'd been and the people they might still become. The construction began on clean ground 20 miles from the contaminated grave of their old home, but close enough that they could visit when they needed to remember who they'd been before they learned to become who they were meant to be all along. Alexander's wealth, distributed rather than hoarded, became the foundation not of empire but of community, not of power but of possibility, not of monuments to one man's guilt, but of homes where families could grow gardens without fear that beauty would become poison. Clara's bakery rose at the center of the new town, not because she demanded it, but because everyone agreed that community needs a heart, and hearts need to be fed with more than money, with more than success. Alexander learned to knead bread the way Clara's grandmother had once taught her, the way she now taught him. Hands that had signed contracts worth billions now working with flour and water, and the kind of patience that money can't buy, can't rush, can't replace. Bread rises because it's patient, Clara told him on the first morning when he arrived at 5 a.m., like an apprentice, like a student, because it understands that good things take time, that rushing kills what you're trying to create. The memorial they built acknowledged all victims. Not just the official ones, not just the legally recognized casualties, but everyone who'd been hurt by the systematic transformation of love into weapon, of care into exploitation. Alexander's name appeared on the memorial not as benefactor, not as hero, not as villain, but as Alexander Stone, age 7 to 37, who got lost on his way home and spent 30 years finding his way back to the people who'd never stopped believing that he would remember who he used to be. 2 years later, the town that rebuilt itself from the ashes of systematic betrayal had become something no urban planner had ever imagined, something no architect had ever drawn, something no corporation could ever own or operate or optimize for profit. It had become a place where people mattered more than margins, where relationships mattered more than returns, where the daily act of caring for each other had become the foundation of an economy that measured success by the number of people who had enough to eat, enough to hope, enough to believe that tomorrow could be different from, better than, more beautiful than today. Clara stood in her bakery at 5 a.m. as she had every morning for 40 years, but now she wasn't alone. Alexander worked beside her, his hands finally learning the rhythm that his heart had always known, the rhythm of creation rather than destruction, of nurturing rather than consuming. "You were right," he said, as he shaped a loaf that would feed a family he was learning to know, to care about, to see as more than demographics, more than statistics, more than acceptable losses. "About what?" Clara asked, though she knew what he meant. That some things can never be bought or sold, that the most important victories don't show up on balance sheets, that building something beautiful sometimes requires destroying everything you thought you knew about success. Clara smiled, the smile of someone who'd spent a lifetime waiting for proof that patience was stronger than power, that love was more durable than money, that hope planted deep enough in good soil could survive even the most systematic attempts to poison the ground where dreams take root. The real ceremony, the one that mattered, happened every morning when Clara's hands taught Alexander's hands to knead bread, the way love kneads hearts. Slowly, patiently, with the kind of pressure that shapes without breaking, that transforms without destroying, that creates something new from ingredients that have always existed but have never been combined with quite this much hope, quite this much faith, quite this much stubborn belief that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to accept it. Have you ever been forgotten inside your own life? Have you ever felt invisible, even to people who should see you clearly? Have you ever wondered if the pain you carry has purpose, if the love you give matters, if the hope you hold against all evidence, against all reason, against all odds, is worth the weight of carrying it through days that offer no proof that carrying it makes any difference to anyone, including yourself? This story is for you, for every woman who has loved without limit, cared without condition, hoped without guarantee that hope would ever be rewarded with anything resembling justice, resembling recognition, resembling the kind of happy ending that life rarely provides but that hearts keep believing might still be possible, if we just love hard enough, long enough, stubbornly enough. Clara Martinez taught Alexander Stone that bread rises because it's patient, that love grows because it's persistent, that redemption happens because forgiveness is stronger than revenge, because understanding is more powerful than hatred, because hope, planted in good soil, watered with tears, nurtured with the kind of faith that survives everything, including systematic attempts to kill it, will eventually grow into something beautiful enough to feed not just the body but the soul, the spirit, the part of humanity that no amount of money can buy, can sell, can own, can destroy. Because in the end, we are all just children trying to find our way home, trying to remember what it felt like to be loved without conditions, without contracts, without calculations about whether we deserve it, whether we've earned it, whether we're worth the investment of someone else's precious, irreplaceable hope. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're patient, if we're stubborn enough to keep believing that love is the only architecture strong enough to build anything worth living in, we find that home was never a place we lost, but a choice we make every day to see each other as more than strangers, more than competitors, more than obstacles to our own success. We find that home is what happens when we choose to stay, to build, to love, to hope despite everything that suggests that staying is foolish, that building is pointless, that loving is dangerous, that hoping is the luxury that survival cannot afford. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to forgive someone who destroyed part of you, part of your dreams, part of your faith, in the possibility that people are basically good, basically worth saving, basically capable of redemption if someone loves them stubbornly enough to wait for the person they could become, to emerge from the person they've been forced to be? Because sometimes the greatest revenge is forgiveness. The strongest victory is understanding. The most lasting monument is the simple, daily choice to see each other as worthy of love, worthy of hope, worthy of the chance to become more than the sum of our mistakes, our failures, our desperate attempts to matter in a world that profits from convincing us that we don't, that we can't, that we shouldn't even try.